The occasion for the conference was, as often happens with these things, it was almost random. I was talking to Norbert, as I often do, and he was telling me about the report that the IDB produced last year on the early years, which, by the way, is a great report and book. We will be hearing later on some of it. And we were thinking about all these issues and how all the great material in the book could connect better with the academic world. And at the same time, we were thinking about, where do we stand on early childhood interventions and research? There's been lots of activities in the last 10 years or so. It's become very fashionable too. There are lots of governments responding to it. But really, what do we know? And so we came about the idea of having a conference that would definitely involve academics, definitely involve the policymakers, and so to kind of take a stand on this thing, taking the opportunity of the publication of the report last year. And so to discuss this issue, take a stand what are the unanswered challenges, where does the research go, what have we learned so far, and where do we go from here, from where we are.
Before doing that, I'd like to emphasize what Orazio was saying, that there's been, certainly in Latin America, which is the area that we've been working on, there's been both a lot of policy innovation, a lot of governments trying to do things, as well as a lot of serious research on a variety of issues related to early childhood development. And so this was a very good time to really try to bring all of this, take stock of all of this. And the report, what it does is, in some sense, it does exactly that stock taking. And it shows, amongst other things, that although Latin America has made a lot of progress in terms of child health and nutrition, it's made a lot less progress in terms of other dimensions of development, in particular issues of cognitive and language development. And then it shows that various environments are critical in shaping children's outcomes, the family, and then that raises the question of what kinds of interventions make sense with families. Child care centers, many more children in Latin America are gradually going to child care centers. We know that the quality of these child care centers tends to be very low. And then early schooling, virtually all of the children in Latin America, this is where the region is quite different from other poor regions like Africa, but by age 5, certainly age 6, just about all children in the region are in school or are trending, if you want, the countries are trending towards having all of their children in school. And so the quality of early schooling becomes very important. And so these kinds of issues and the fact that governments really are trying hard, more so in some countries than others, but trying hard to figure out ways to implement policies that might actually make sense in these different environments, led us to write the report. And then, as Orazio was saying in various conversations we were having, led us to think that it'd be very useful to sort of take stock of what the research agenda moving forward should be. I think that's an important issue that Sally also raised.
Yeah, and relating to something that Sally said earlier today, I think there is a great, exciting time to do research in this field. I mean, everybody's talking about it. You get lots of attention. I think there are also huge risks, and that's something that Sally keeps saying. And the risk is that now this is very fashionable. Everybody's celebrating and clapping and saying, "Oh, this is really the answer to end poverty in the long run," and all that. And one starts neglecting the issues that, yeah, it is important, but it's also extremely hard to get interventions. The reason why we still have so many children that are at risk of achieving their full potential, as usually every introduction of a paper in this field goes, is because it's extremely hard to get there, to get to good outcomes. And there is no silver bullet. And we know that there are some interventions that work. We don't fully understand how they work. And more importantly, it's extremely difficult to scale them up. One thing is to do a small pilot with extremely good professionals. Another thing is to scale that up for a whole country or even for a whole region. In that sense, the work that has been going on at the IDB, we'll listen to some of it later this afternoon, is incredibly useful. So they took an intervention and work inspired by the Jamaica study and the Colombian study, and then tried to scale it up in the whole of Peru, which is pretty amazing. And obviously you have fidelity problems, and it's almost natural to expect that impacts will be much lower. But we need to have these studies, and we need to look with a microscope how these things develop.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's sort of a sequence from efficacy trials to pilots, somewhat larger pilots, but eventually we want these things to benefit all the children who we think should benefit and who are at risk. That's a charitable way of saying it. Many of them just have very low levels of development. I'll give you an example. In Ecuador, in rural Ecuador, roughly half the children by the time they're 4 are more than a year delayed in terms of their language development. So it's obviously the efficacy trials are very important in showing us what has the potential to work, but translating that into large-scale policy is a huge leap. And it's a huge leap in various domains. It's certainly very difficult to do that at the family level. We don't have as much experience there. It's also a real difficulty when we get to interventions that have to do with center-based care. We find things that work very well. You take the preschool program or what have you, that work very well at small scale. But how to do that when you're not talking of 200 kids, but for example, in terms of school-age children in any one of these countries, you're talking of many millions of students, hundreds of thousands of teachers. How to get something that works is really an important question. And I think we also have to be realistic in accepting when we see these effect sizes where we say, well, a reasonable effect size is 0.5 standard deviations. That seems to me maybe a reasonable effect size when you're talking of a small scale pilot. But when you're talking really of interventions at scale, very often getting something that sustainably moves the bar by 0.1 or 0.15 standard deviations can have very high returns, and something that actually can be implemented at scale. So I think this is a very important issue.
The other big challenges, in my opinion, is that one is the political economy, because lots of governments are listening, but often they are very short horizon, and therefore they tend to focus on interventions that are not necessarily the best. So it's politically very rentable to open up a big new nursery and cut the ribbon and all that, but it's not completely clear that that's the best policy. And indeed, if you are not careful about what you put into the nursery, in particular in terms of curriculum, structural activities for the children, it's not clear that those things have any impact at all. That's one thing. The other thing that we struggle as researchers, and it's a completely underappreciated issue, is that of measurement. Virtually there are, with the exception of the Jamaica study, which is 129 children, there is no long-run follow-up of how certain dimensions of development in, say, age 2, 3, 4, 5 are reflected in adult outcomes. There are none, and I've been looking around. And so, we are putting a lot of weight on those 129 children, or now youths from Jamaica, from Kingston, and we know nothing else. And I think this issue of getting new measurements, longitudinal measures, high-quality measures, which in the case of children development might be very hard, is a first-order importance, in my opinion. It's very underappreciated.
I think that's absolutely right, and in two dimensions, actually. I think one of the reasons why Latin America has improved so much in terms of nutritional status is because it was measured. It has been measured for the last 20 years. For every country in the region, we know what the stunting rates are of children at a national scale, on a yearly basis in most countries, and in many cases disaggregated at a much smaller scale. So I think that has focused policymakers' attention, and it's also, and I think this is particularly important, it's also created a sense of it's unacceptable for a country, say, like Brazil, to have 30% of its children be stunted, which is what was the case, say, 25 years ago. And a sort of a mobilization that you cannot be in a middle-income country. You can't aspire to be a real upper middle income country if a third of your young children are malnourished. And we have nothing like that with other dimensions of development. We know nothing like that. And so there's, to my mind, I mean, there are difficult issues, but I feel like there is also sort of a quarrel about exactly, well, this measure doesn't pick up this, doesn't pick up that, and that's been at to the detriment of actually measuring something that reasonably well approximates underlying well-being and measuring it and consistently so we can see how these children develop and how this impacts what happens to them later on. You'll see later on presented actually tomorrow the work that, obviously we know the work that you guys have been doing in Bogota on concurrent validity of various instruments, but even also looking at predictive validity. We know, for example, children in Ecuador, these children I was talking to you about before, we know that those children who by a very simple test were doing quite badly at age 4 have a much higher probability of doing very badly in school 10 years later. So a very simple test is something that, in this case, would have allowed us to make a reasonable job at identifying these at-risk children, certainly a lot better than not measuring anything.
Yeah, and the risk there, and something that Sally mentioned this morning, is that many of the people who have been in charge of testing for child development, they see these tests are identifying really abnormal kids. So that is a screening test, like almost pathological, rather than something like the height. It has to be said, height is much easier to measure than child development. Height is height, although there are issues there as well. But I think there should be much more. And language is something that is reasonably easy to measure. You have to be careful because different cultures might develop language in different ways. But the ability to say words at certain ages is really relatively easy to measure. Absolutely. And it's a great predictor of long term. So I think there should be more measurement in that direction for sure.